If you are just joining, a reminder to introduce yourself in the chat. Go ahead and state your name, and if you are here representing an organization, which organization you're affiliated with. Just as a reminder, if you're not on the commission, to go ahead and please switch your cameras off. That way, when we do the recording, we'll be able to see all of the commissioners' faces pop up on the front screen. And thanks for bearing with us as we do all of this stuff virtually as we're socially distancing. We're very excited tonight to have Dr. Felicia Bell joining us. And we're going to be having a presentation from her in a little bit. But just before we get to that, a couple of administrative items. Let me pull that up. All of our subcommittee meeting times are now posted on our PAC website. This is on the Montgomery County Council website. And our next meeting for the full commission will be on April 12th at 6:30 p.m. I think those were all the updates we had, right, Carlos?
Yeah, and I just posted the PAC website in the chat in case anybody wants to look at the meeting dates.
Perfect. So before we hear from Dr. Bell, let me go ahead and share a little bit about our speaker tonight. Dr. Felicia Bell is Senior Advisor to Dr. Anthea M. Hartig, the Elizabeth Macmillan Director at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. She is the first African American to serve in this position and the highest ranking African American at the museum. A public historian and museum field leader, Bell began her appointment on March 2nd with responsibility for enacting the museum's 2020 strategic plan. She guided the museum's senior leadership team in translating the 10-year strategic plan into an annual tactical plan designed to achieve the vision of becoming the most accessible, inclusive, relevant, and sustainable public history institution in the nation. In addition, she led the American Alliance of Museums re-accreditation process for the museum, its first in 15 years. Just 4 months later, Dr. Bell was selected by Smithsonian Secretary Lonnie Bunch to serve on the content development team for the Smithsonian's Race, Community, and Our Shared Initiative Future. Previously, Dr. Bell was the director of Troy University's Rosa Parks Museum, where she formulated policies, developed a strategic plan, and cultivated over $100,000 in gifts, supervised a full-time staff of 6, and oversaw all operations of the museum, which is a 7,000 square foot facility with an 1,800 square foot temporary exhibitions gallery, a 102-seat auditorium, and a children's wing. In 2018, Dr. Bell was awarded over $134,000 in grant funding to support educational programs, audiovisual upgrades, and cultural events at the museum. Dr. Bell was an assistant professor of history and the inaugural director of honors at the Savannah State University. During her tenure there, she introduced museum studies courses into the curriculum and received the first historically Black colleges and universities museum internship program grant from the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture to fund students pursuing internships at local museums and historic sites. In addition, she was awarded over $8,000 in grant funding to provide service learning projects for students, including a grant for the restoration of LePageville Memorial Cemetery, an historic African American cemetery in Savannah, Georgia. Dr. Bell has been a museum professional for more than 20 years. She served as Director of Education and Outreach at the Coastal Heritage Society in Savannah, Georgia, and at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society in Washington, D.C. While in Washington, she curated a nationally traveling exhibition, provided expert witness testimony to Congress for the recognition of enslaved labor used to construct the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and participated in the National Capital Planning Committee's Environmental Impact Statement for the Smithsonian National Museum of American History and Culture, National Museum of African American History and Culture. She has received numerous awards and honors, including the 2020 Citizen of the Year Award from the Montgomery, Alabama alumni chapter of the Delta Sigma Theta sorority. Dr. Bell is a contributing author in The Future Emerges from the Past, celebrating 200 years of Alabama African American history and culture, and a contributing editor to A Girl Named Rosa, The True Story of Rosa Parks. Dr. Bell earned her Bachelor of Arts degree in history from Savannah State University, a Master of Arts in Historic Preservation from Savannah College of Art and Design, and a PhD in U.S. history from Howard University in Washington, D.C. When she is not working at a museum or visiting one, she enjoys traveling to other countries, antique buying, outdoor concerts, and supporting HBCUs. We are so thrilled to have Dr. Bell here with us. Dr. Bell, if you'd like to start your presentation now. Thank you so much.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for such a generous introduction. I appreciate that, Shabab, and I'm so pleased and honored to be here today. And thank you to the Montgomery County Policing Advisory Commission for inviting me to speak today. And thank you so much for having me. I'm just delighted and looking forward to getting into this presentation with you. I'm going to share my screen now. And hopefully we can do this efficiently. Let's see. Okay, let's see here. Can everyone see the slide? Is it showing like the whole screen or just the slide?
Just the slide. I don't think you're in presentation view.
Okay. Let's see. Let's stop this. Okay.
But I mean, that was okay. I think we could have followed along.
Okay. Okay. Now this should be just the slide, right? Okay, very good. Thanks so much. Okay, so this presentation, I call it History Doesn't Repeat Itself, but It Often Rhymes, Recurrences in Policing African Americans. And so this quote is accredited to Mark Twain. And what I'm saying here is that, you know, you'll see through the presentation how we see patterns, okay? And so in policing, and you'll see where things happen historically, and then you can see the pattern, you can see it happening again in the future, and where we are now. And when you reflect on it, it's not quite exactly as it happened in the past, but very similar. And so, but at the end, we're going to see how we can turn things around for the better, and how communities have actually had success with that. And so let's take a look. Let's see. Okay, so we'll start with the Fugitive Slave Clause and Acts. And so the Fugitive Slave Clause is part of the Constitution. And what it's saying here is that anyone who is enslaved and they escape, that they can be captured and then, you know, given back to their owner. Okay, and so what this clause did is it authorized the local government, and then eventually the federal government got involved with capturing and returning enslaved people to their owners, because they were considered property. And so when you ran away, as you know, enslaved people didn't have to wait for the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment to be free. So they freed themselves by running away. And so when that happened, that meant that property was taken away from the owners. So this is Congress, the legislative branch, enacting a law that allowed these owners of enslaved people and local governments, and eventually the federal government, to continue with this institution of slavery and enforce capture of enslaved people. So let's take a look. So you have the 1793 Slave Act, Fugitive Slave Act, and then the one in 1850. There's a difference in that the 1850 is the one that private citizens are then forced to return enslaved people that they find to owners. And so otherwise they would have a penalty of a fine and then time in jail. Okay. And so even in the North, where you have free states, private citizens there also were responsible for returning enslaved people who had escaped to the North. So let's see what happens. So here we have a runaway advertisement where the reward is for capture of an enslaved woman named Emily. She's 17. One thing about runaway advertisements is they tell us a lot about enslaved people. We learn so much because they're different from when you have sale advertisements, because then owners are embellishing, right? Because they want to get the most they can from this for their property. So here with runaway advertisements, they're more accurate and they give us a glimpse into what enslaved people look like, what they sounded like, about their character. So here, Emily is 17 years old, and she supposedly has a whining voice, and she's dark in color, and she's wearing a calico, which is kind of like a shift dress, and of raw cotton materials. And so she has run away from her owner in Kentucky. And Kentucky was a slave state. And so she probably ran away to Ohio, which was a free state. So all she would have had to do was cross the Ohio River. She would have been in a free state. And of course, the reward is higher if she's captured from Ohio. So here we have the Fugitive Slave Act, where you have advertisement. And then if a private citizen would have captured Emily in Ohio, they would have been obligated to return her to the owner. Here, the next slide, Boston in Massachusetts, another free state, where you have citizens posting advertisement for African Americans there who are free, warning them to be careful and to look out for slave catchers, because in some instances, these slave catchers would capture free Blacks and send them into slavery. So here it's warning them to be on the lookout, if you will, for these slave catchers. So these slave catchers are essentially enforcing law. And in many instances, they were abusive to captured individuals because they didn't own them. So they had no investment in this property. They're there to capture them and to get paid. And so they also used hounds, which we'll get to in a moment. And so you have all these factors in place, and we'll see how it rhymes in a little bit. So here we have Negro dogs, so-called Negro dogs in use, where these dogs were trained using enslaved people, abusing them in ways to train dogs to capture enslaved people and to attack them as well. So this is an advertisement where someone is advertising for Negro dogs. And so these were, all over newspapers at the time, for slave catchers to solicit help of so-called Negro dogs. Here's another advertisement in a newspaper where someone is advertising they have well-trained Negro dogs for catching, specifically for capturing runaway enslaved people. And here you have an engraving of so-called Negro dogs capturing an escaped enslaved person. And this weaponizing of animals is continued into the 20th century, the modern civil rights movement, with law enforcement using canines against peaceful demonstrators, weaponizing them to attack them. So here is a 17-year-old civil rights activist peacefully protesting and attacked by police dogs. So you see where it's not necessarily an enslaved person escaping and everything, but where the history is rhyming now, right? Okay, let's take a look. So here, the 13th Amendment is passed. So this now, we're right after the Civil War. President Lincoln is able to get this amendment passed before he is killed at the Ford's Theater. And so this amendment actually solidified the end of slavery in the United States, where his Emancipation Proclamation only freed enslaved people in regions and states occupied by the Confederacy. So here we have all enslaved people freed. And then this part in red says, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So what that means is that the legislative branch can then use their power to enact laws to enforce what it's already saying in the Constitution. And we know that comes when we get into civil rights acts, which happened as early as 1866, and then several other civil rights acts, voting rights acts, all these other acts, right? Enforcement acts, Klans acts, all these other acts that Congress has to do, because even though the Constitution says one thing, what actually happens in real life in the South is something totally different. So right after this 13th Amendment is passed, then you have these Black codes go into place, and they are modeled after the slave codes when slavery was in place to keep African Americans oppressed. So here, Black codes do the same thing, and pig laws as well. So the Black codes are meant to maintain white supremacy and to keep white folks in positions of power. And here you have, they have lost the war. The South is in an economic bind. You have Black folks who are trying to exercise freedom and independence. And these laws are used to keep them oppressed. So they have to have a written evidence of employment. They have to forfeit wages if they want to terminate a contract early. They have to, they have apprenticeship laws where if, their children, if the parents can't seem to take care of their children, if a judge feels like they can't do that, they can take your kids, and then their kids are assigned to apprenticeship and forced to labor. And then pig laws are simply just laws where African Americans stole farm animals, mostly because they were hungry. So these and other laws were put in place to keep African Americans oppressed. And I want to just go back. I meant to go back. I want to go back to the Negro dogs for just a second and just talk about the relevance of this even today. In 2013 in Los Angeles, The Los Angeles Times reported that 100% of the victims of police fights in LA County in the first 6 months of 2013 were Black or Latinx. And in 2015, the Center for Policing Equity did a study of police departments across the United States. And they found that there was a rate at which officers used force by canine against Black people, more than double of what they used against white people. So here you're seeing where it's remnants of what has happened in the past still occurring today. All right, so now with the 14th Amendment, when this is passed, now African Americans are gaining citizenship, okay? But the other part of this amendment that's probably just as much or more important than that is that you have guaranteed due process, all right, and equal protection under the law. Those are very important, and we're going to see how that comes into place when we get into lynching in just a moment. Okay, so the 15th Amendment, excuse me, also this amendment grants the right to African American men to vote, okay? Women still can't vote. Black women can't vote until much, much later when we get into the Voting Rights Act, and that guarantees that Black women can vote. So if we keep going, we get to lynching. Now, this is when it's really on a rise after the Civil War, during that Reconstruction period, all the way up until the mid-1940s. We'll get to that in a minute. But lynching is on the rise in the South. As I said before, you have African Americans trying to live freely and independently, and Southerners trying to hold on to their place in society. And so then we have these acts of violence. So lynching, by definition, means to punish, usually by death, and we'll get to that in a minute, for an alleged legal offense or an infraction of social mores without due process. So social mores would have been like going to a front door instead of going to the back door of someone's home, or even there were instances of someone being lynched because they annoyed a white woman, or vagrancy, standing on the corner, nowhere to go, just infractions, simple infractions like that. This extra legal process took place where these mobs gathered to enforce the law themselves. This vigilante justice is what happened. So some of the key points about lynching that people tend to get confused about is that sometimes there were survivors of lynchings. And then also, not all lynchings occurred in the South. There were some that occurred in the Midwest and West before they started occurring in the South in great numbers. And so it's not just African Americans who were lynched. There were Jews, Italian Americans, Chinese Americans, Native Americans, white men, white women, were all victims of lynching in the United States. And the Ku Klux Klan was not responsible for all lynching. Sometimes it was just a couple or three individuals get together and decide that they want to enact vigilante justice. So here is an instance where this is the Moores Ford lynching that occurred in my home state of Georgia. And this happened to two couples in 1946, just 50 miles outside of Atlanta in Walton County, Georgia. It's not far from Athens, Georgia, near University of Georgia. And so what happened is George Dorsey, he is a World War II veteran. And he's the brother of Roger Dorsey, and Roger is married to Dorothy. Dorothy is 7 months pregnant, okay? And May is on the far left, okay? May and George, and then Roger and Dorothy. So unfortunately, Roger was accused, and he did attack his landlord and stabbed him in the back. And so he went to jail for that. And then the bail was set very low. It was set very low at about, I think, $500. And he was bailed out. So there's question about this bail being set so low so that he could be bailed out. So his wife had pleaded with their boss to bail him out so that he could work off this bail. And so when he went to get them out of jail, the other couple went along with them. And unfortunately, they were met by a mob of white men who took all of the two couples out of the car and grabbed them, and the women began to call out the names of some of these white men. They recognized them. And so that is when they said, well, we need to kill them too, because they're going to talk. They know who we are. And so they took them over to a thicket area and shot all of them. And there were about 60 shots fired altogether. And so they were all killed. And so this was the last mass lynching in the United States. There were about 15 to 20 members of the mob. And the governor at the time said that they were all known by name, but that none of them were ever charged with the murders. And the grand jury decided not to charge them. So no one was ever indicted for this crime. So this is an image of the funeral for the two couples. And George Dorsey was a World War II veteran. So you see the flag there draped over his coffin. And this is the church on the right where they have the funeral service. So when we look at the reason why I'm bringing up lynching is because it's still relevant today. You know, this is another instance where history is rhyming. And so, you know, we have here this chart where you'll see this first chart here. What we're looking at is how these counties that had lynching, high numbers of lynching years ago, have high numbers of officer-involved shootings today. Okay, and so these historical lynchings are positively associated with officer-involved shootings for Blacks. That is, that the counties that experience higher number of historical lynchings have larger shares of officer-involved shootings of Black in the last 5 years, just in the last 5 years. And then this next chart, you'll see that the opposite is happening for whites. As the number of historical lynchings increases, the share of modern officer-involved shootings of whites decreases. So you see what's happening here? So, you know, it's, you know, these things that have happened in the past are still relevant for us today. So let's take a look at what's happening later in the South. We get into the modern civil rights movement. And we're looking at here the interior of a segregated bus. And as you can see, it's not a happy place, okay? These buses were often crowded. Many African Americans, especially in Montgomery, where I've just come from directing the Rosa Parks Museum there, did not own their own personal vehicles, so they depended on public transportation. And so the buses were very crowded. These folks were mistreated by the bus drivers who had policing powers. They carried firearms and they had the authority of police. One of the social mores, or the ways in which African Americans use the bus, they entered the bus from the front, paid their fare, got off of the bus, and re-entered from the rear. But oftentimes bus drivers drove off before they could, after they paid the fare and before they could re-enter from the rear. So this is just one of the ways that African American passengers were mistreated by bus drivers who had that extended law enforcement power. And of course, we know Claudette Colvin, who was arrested 6 months prior to Mrs. Parks' arrest. Claudette Colvin was 15 years old at the time, and she was told to give up her seat for a white passenger, and she refused. And in the process of being arrested, she was sexually assaulted by the arresting officers. Miss Colvin wore a dress that day and was touched inappropriately and was assaulted. And then, of course, we had the arrest of Mrs. Parks in December of that same year. This is from the second time Mrs. Parks was arrested during the mass demonstration they had in February the following year. But on December 1st, 1955, Mrs. Parks was arrested for not giving up her seat. And when she was in jail, she called her husband, and her friends, Clifford and Virginia Durr, ended up going to the jail to bail her out, along with her attorney, Fred Gray. And it was imperative that they get her out that night because unfortunately, when Black women were incarcerated, the longer they stayed in jail, the higher the chances for them to be sexually assaulted. So just wanted to raise that point about conditions in jail. Here we have an instance, of course, this is Bloody Sunday, when troops attacked peaceful demonstrators on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Here is an instance of law enforcement attacking peaceful demonstrators at a wade-in in St. Augustine, Florida. This happened on beaches up and down the southeastern coast where Black young people trying to integrate beaches. Dorothy Cotton says here, I remember the wade-ins because the bump hasn't gone off my jaw yet. They started yelling obscenities at us, but we went on. Myself and a group of teenage girls. We were afraid, but we felt we just had to go on. Yet when white Americans peacefully protest, we've seen instances where law enforcement officers engage with them positively. Here we see at the recent Women's March, they even exchange hats and, headgear, and everybody's friendly and nice and helpful to each other. And here is at the Black Lives Matter March, where the protester has a sign that says, I'll see you nice white ladies at the next Black Lives Matter March, right? So we have very differing perceptions of law enforcement and their role when citizens are peacefully protesting. Here is a woman who's protesting peacefully. She's holding a flower in her hands, and law enforcement in all this tactical gear is ready to grab her, and they ended up arresting her. Very different interactions. So, but how are we getting it right? So let's take a look. Newark, this is a Newark police officer here, Newark, New Jersey. So what they've learned is that they, in 2020, what happened is that it's remarkable. The police department there had no shootings the entire year of 2020, none of the police officers fired a weapon. They had zero shootings. It was remarkable. And when they asked the chief how that happened, he said, well, we took de-escalation training, right? And so this was critical to changing the way the police interacted with the community. And so what they learned is that the old-fashioned way of officers wanting to win confrontation changed. And so the Brian O'Hara, who's the deputy chief overseeing the training, he said it was a paramilitary kind of training before, just focused on stopping the threat. Whereas now the model is to calm things down, engage the threatening person while creating distance or taking cover and buying time until reinforcements arrive. And Newark officers, they view videos presenting challenging scenarios, they offer responses, then discuss it with their supervisors. So there's a whole different process in the way that they train now. So it's not about resolving the situation as quickly as you can, but how you protect the sanctity of every life, is what he said. So this is one way in which a police department has had success. Another way is in Denver, Colorado, with the STAR program, Support Team Assistant Response, STAR program. So over 6 months of this program, the pilot program, they received more than 2,500 emergency calls that fell into the STAR program's purview. And the STAR team was able to respond to 748 calls. None of the calls required assistance of the police and no one was arrested. And the Denver police responded to nearly 95,000 incidents over the same period, suggesting that the expanded STAR program reduced police calls by nearly 3%. So the STAR program is these folks here in this van. This is a social worker. The woman is a social worker or mental health care person, professional, and then there's an EMT, and they go to a call with a mental health issue, and they take care of that person on the scene rather than calling the police. So at the Rosa Parks Museum, we had similar programs where we engage the community with the police in a positive way. So the museum becomes a safe space. And so here we have Coffee with a Cop. These were all over the community, different parts of the community and neighborhoods usually. So here we have it in the museum space, and anybody who lives in the neighborhood can come to the museum during Coffee with a Cop and just have coffee with a cop and talk to them about whatever issues you're having in your neighborhood that you need some help with. We also engage the cadets during their training. I would teach a course about policing in the historic city. And similar to this presentation about relations between police and community. And specifically in Montgomery, where police, have had a very, tragic, in some cases, history with the community. So we have a presentation, we talk, we ask questions, and then they come to the museum and get a tour. And just learn a little bit, engage a little bit more about their community and the history of it. And here at the end, toward the end of their training, this is sort of an inspection of the cadets and just an opportunity for me to go to each cadet and talk to them and just wish them well and just letting them know to remember that they're there to protect and serve their communities. Well, I just have one more thing is that this is a similar program in Washington, D.C. with the Metropolitan Police Department. Dr. Sharita Jacobs Thompson is a colleague of mine, and her colleague, Dr. Bernard Dimsuk, they do the same thing. They do a course. It's it's a class called History of Policing in African American Communities. The veterans of the department are trained for 1 day in a 10-hour course. And the cadets take a class over 2 days for 16 hours. And there are 3,800 officers and 600 cadets to date that have graduated from their program. So this is doable. And there are ways in which police departments can turn things around with their community in a positive way by engaging museums or historic sites and in other ways to make things better. So I thank you for your time today.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Dr. Bell. That was all of history in 15 minutes, it seems like. Thank you so much. I think particularly for connecting all these threads to the criminal justice system in the US. I think some parts of this history are familiar to a lot of us on the commission, but it was really helpful to see the details, the stories, but I think more than anything, the connections to how we police in this country. That was so powerful. I'd love to open it up for questions, but if I may take moderator's privilege to ask the first question while folks have a chance to gather their thoughts. I was really curious when you said at the very beginning about these individuals not waiting for legislation. You know, they freed themselves, as you were saying. What struck me was the number of young Black people throughout history, especially the ones, you know, you cited individuals like Emily in your presentation. At the time, they were freeing themselves, but what they were doing was also illegal.
Right.
So at what point in history do we start to understand the actions of an individual like Emily to be freeing herself and not, here is a young Black person who's done something illegal? So when does our understanding of Emily's actions change?
Well, you know, I think you have to put it in context with that time period, right? And so we're looking at it from a contemporary lens, right? And we've had all these events that have happened since Emily and her time. So putting in context with that time period and laws that were in place, yes, she was stealing away, as they said, she was stealing herself away. You know, she was considered property. So, but looking now back, and we look at legislation like 13th Amendment and, you know, Emancipation Proclamation, all these other things that happened where, you know, and events of history have changed. And so we know that that enslavement was an atrocity and was oppressive and all these things and inhumane. And so we know now that you know, she was freeing herself. And even, but, you know, even then though, during that time period, you had individuals who knew that slavery was wrong. You had abolitionists. You had folks on the Underground Railroad who supported them. You know, and so even then, even despite the Fugitive Slave Act, you had allies who were endangering themselves and endangering their own lives and their own property and their own families to protect folks like Emily. And so, you know, she probably didn't get, if she went across the Ohio River, she didn't get there by herself. She would have had to have someone to help her get across, right? So, you know, you had folks back then who knew that she was freeing herself. So even then you had that. I hope that answers your question.
For sure, thank you so much.
Eric has an interesting question in the chat.
Eric, do you want to ask it yourself?
Thanks, everyone. Dr. Bell, thank you so much. Very, very rich history that you've given us and shared with us. I'm a lawyer, and I've thought about the role of the courts and the police in the collaboration with the slave catching machinery. And I wondered about the role of judges in ordering persons who are alleged to be fugitive slaves to be then entrusted to the slave catcher and taken, you know, by force back to the place from which they are alleged to have fled. I'm curious, you know, what were the burdens of proof? How much time was needed by a court in processing these cases? How much of the courts, which are now our criminal courts, were engaged, routinely in these determinations? What kind of burden of proof might a slave catcher have to establish that the person that they assert is the fugitive, as opposed to just someone that
they didn't have it. They didn't have it, my friend. I mean, it was just if they had, if they were captured, it was a federal judge, not a local judge, that was responsible for turning the enslaved person over. So that was at the federal level. And if the federal judge deemed that they were escaped property, then they would go back to they would be sent back to the owner. And then you had people who had free blacks who had freedom papers, and that was ignored. And slave catchers would capture them. See, they just want money, so they they don't care about papers and is this, they just want the person, and they just want to get the money, the reward, and what the law allows as far as that goes. So, but there wasn't necessarily a burden of proof. And, it's, a lot of times these owners, they just go by, they have a reward, as I showed you, that was descriptive and describe this person. And if that looked like the person, because, the enslaved person is not carrying a driver's license like we have today, right? So it, it was flimsy, you know what I mean? Fluid.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. I see questions from Nadia and then Alicia. But just as a reminder, if other folks who are here in attendance want to ask questions as well, please feel free to either raise your hand or put them into the chat. Nadia?
I can't see the chat, but thank you.
Oh.
Sure thing. We'll make sure to read it out if someone puts it in there.
I think, I guess it wasn't just a question, and I guess I want to hear your perspective on, you mentioned, slave catchers having this kind of reward that they're looking at, and what the connection might be to private prisons now, because in a lot of ways, a lot of the criminalization of different types of activities, and you look at the drug war, at the war on drugs, and figuring out what that was targeting and what communities he was really going after. How has this economic force of reward for different type of people capitalized on bodies at this point? Because what is your perspective on how private prisons are operating in knowing the history of how economics played when it came to people being things and being able to be captured for a reward?
So you're asking the relation between Fugitive Slave Act and rewards for capturing enslaved people, and the connection between that and private prisons?
Yeah, because they kind of bank on the kind of same theory of people doing something that is deemed illegal, and then entering a system that profits from them being in capture.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yes. So again, you're seeing where it rhymes, right? So it's not necessarily the same thing, but very similar. I do think that sometimes, things that we're doing currently have foundation in historically, so not quite the same connection. But I think I understand what you're saying, in that there are some similarities there. And certainly these prisons are benefiting. And also just the process of, when people go to jail and they have, parole and all these things, they have to pay these fines and they can't pay them, so there's also that. And then if you look at similar system with the convict leasing system, that was during that time period I was telling you about, when you know, you weren't enslaved, but you were kept into this system of servitude, right? And you know, you did hard labor. And that whole system kind of leads us to this massive prison industrial complex that we have today. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Dr. Bell.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Okay.
We'll go to Alicia, and I've had some folks messaging me directly, so feel free to do that as well. Alicia and then Jerome.
Okay, Dr. Bell, we're all aware of the 17-year-old young white man who killed several people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And I don't know if you've seen the video, but I saw it and I was taken aback. How an basically armored vehicle full of police officers. The young kid had a rifle strapped around his body and walked toward the officers without officers saying anything to him, threatening him or anything. And contrast, and then also looking at the Capitol riots and the behavior, the conduct of some of the officers there. What is your opinion and given your expertise and knowledge of the history of this country and how policing has the rhyming that is going on, the patterns that are going on, what is your perspective? What can you share with us regarding your opinion of that?
Well, thank you for that question. I actually wrote an op-ed recently in the Washington Post about the armed insurrection at the Capitol, because actually my area of expertise, my research is around the enslaved labor that built the U.S. Capitol. So that day I was very, very upset at what I was seeing happening, and just thinking about the role of all those enslaved craftsmen who built this building for democracy. And then here we have this armed group of people keeping democracy from happening at the very place where democracy lives. And so just so many dynamics there, but you know, it's tough, you know, to see those things, to see, you know, the discrepancies. I don't know, as an historian, I am hesitant to give opinions a lot because I feel like as an historian, my job is to present the history and let the people determine for themselves how it relates and how they can use that, you know, for their benefit to help them get reparations, help them get justice, whatever they're trying to do. But yeah, I mean, it's disturbing, and you know, I'm tired of seeing Black men being killed, you know, and like a lot of folks, and I'm tired of seeing injustice and just blatant, you know, like you said, walking with a long gun among them, and so just so many differences, and then we just saw just yesterday or whenever it was the day before with this armed man who killed people in Colorado at the grocery store and lived to tell the story, right? Whereas so many men of color have not, even when they were unarmed. So I think the discrepancies are obvious. You know, but we have to figure out how to turn it around. I don't think that's where the story ends. So I think there's time and there's room for change. So that's the part that we have to work on.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. We'll go to Jerome for the last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bell, for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm a teacher of African American history, and so this really spoke to me because I make an effort to, during the year with my high school students, talk specifically about policing, but with that also the 13th Amendment. And oftentimes, as you know, when it's taught, folks tend to say this is when slavery was abolished, but there's a loophole. And slavery and voluntary servitude, I mean, as long as you can criminalize someone, right? There is impact there. And when you shared with me just the programming that you had a chance to see, Coffee with Cops, Newark spoke to me because I'm actually from New Jersey, 20 minutes outside of Newark. And so just the year of them not firing shots and just the de-escalation trainings, that meant a lot to me. And I'm wondering, like, when you go to these programs and events, is the harm, the severity of the 13th Amendment and how it's been used? Are folks having those conversations? And are they talking about it and discussing that in these platforms, in these
They
forums?
are. You know, there's scholars who are actually critical of you know, folks who are talking about the 13th Amendment and its relationship with mass incarceration, because, you know, white Southerners didn't need a loophole to terrorize and kill Black folks, okay? They were doing that anyway. So we have to remember that. And, you know, we have to, you know, sort of understand that, you know, at the same time, there were Blacks who were, you know, unlawfully incarcerated and doing labor in prison. White folks were doing the same. You know, they were incarcerated as well. And you know, so I think it deserves more attention and more critical analysis, making that particular connection between the 13th Amendment and mass incarceration. So we have to, I think you have to be careful with that one. I hope that answers your question. And also,
I appreciate it.
Yes, also what I'd like to do is follow up perhaps with you, and also if I could I can't see the chat, it's a lot going on. So if I could get a copy of the chat and read it afterwards, and then maybe answer folks' question by email, I'm open to do that. Or if I could leave my email address if you like.
We can be sure to do both, Dr. Bell. We'll make sure to share your contact.
Trying to be mindful of the time. I feel like
sure.
I'm long.
This was excellent. This was so wonderful. Thank you so much for presenting with us, for pushing our thinking beyond.
It was a lovely.
Much.
It was a lovely group. Thank you. Good questions. My goodness, wonderful.
Thank you so much. I just want to thank everyone for chiming in, for joining us for this very important presentation and conversation. I want to lift up a couple of things from the chat. A bunch of really great questions from Eric about the role of the judicial system in all of this.
Absolutely.
And a recommendation, an excellent book on convict leasing, Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman.
Yeah.
About the post-war South being rebuilt on forced labor of convict labor authorized by the 13th Amendment. So once again, about that last piece. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll go ahead and end this now in the interest of time. The recording will be available on our website within the next few days. And we'll make sure to save a copy of the chat and share it with you, Dr. Bell. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of the evening, everyone.